UVI recently released Vintage Vault 4, so in this video we're going to take a look at some of the synths that are in this collection and give a listen to a little track that I created using those instruments, some of my favorites from the collection. Now, what exactly is Vintage Vault 4? Well, it is basically, if we take a look at the top here, the Ultimate Vintage Synth Collection. So there's 36 different products or instruments contained within this package with over 14,000 presets that are based on 800,000 samples. So unlike some other synthesizers that you can buy that are emulations of the original hardware equipment, this bundle of instruments is actually based on recorded samples from the original gear. So this is going to allow you access to those expensive, rare, and vintage synthesizers that most of us, I know I can't afford, and going to give you access to that you can play on your computer with your MIDI controller. And so they've gotten these samples from 255 hardware instruments, and we can actually hop to that. We can see some of the UIs for the instruments that are included here. And if we click on the instruments here, we can see a list of everything that's included. And we won't go through every single one of these, but this will just give you an idea of the tons of instruments that you're going to have access to here, like the bitzone, which is a brand new instrument that they recently released for this package. And this is actually based on the Krumar, an Italian synthesizer analog synth from the 80s, I believe, the Krumar Bit 99. And all of these instruments are going to be based on a ton of different gear, ranging from the SP12, the 808, Jupiter 6 and 8, Sun-Sin, Oberheim, Prophet 10, and tons more. You've got the Emulation 2 package here, and Hybrid 6000, Primate Plus, which is based on samples from the 808, PX Memories, the Sunbox. So again, we won't go through every single one of these, but the Beatbox Anthology 2, for instance, this contains samples from 111 drum machines. You've got FM synthesis available to you in the FM suite here, the JP Legacy, which includes samples from the Jupiter 6 and 8 and a couple other. The Mellow for a really unique vintage sound. From the 60s, OB Legacy, again, just a ton here. So for now, let's go ahead and hop over to Studio One, and I'm going to play back this track that I made from several of the instruments that are included in this bundle, some of my favorite ones, like the Sunbox here. This is on track 1, providing the bass here. And as I play back, I'll just switch to the different tracks as some of these instruments come in, just so you can get an idea of the sound that they're creating and the interface for these devices. And then we'll stop the track and then come back to each individual one and take a look at some of the controls and features for each of these instruments. And in the future, I'll release some more in-depth videos for some of my favorite instruments from this bundle, because there's no way that I can cover everything within this one video. We'd be here for a full day. So let's go ahead and play this back, and then we'll take a look at each one a bit more in depth. Okay, so just a basic track that we've got going on here, but now let's hop up to the Sunbox, and then we will take a closer look at that. Now, something to keep in mind with the interfaces for these different instruments is that most of them are based on the kind of layout and design, or more the design of the original analog gear that they're recorded from. But there are a lot of similarities between each of them, in particular the synthesizers, so that you don't have to spend a lot of time learning different interfaces for each one. So for instance, you're going to have the main, edit, mod, effects, and ARP sections for a lot of these synthesizers, and each one, many of them, you're going to have 2 different layers that you can work with. And of course, you'll have your traditional amplitude, filter controls. But if we take a look here, the main is going to give us access to some of the most useful and convenient things. We can switch to the edit to work with the oscillators a bit more in depth and how they function. We then have a mod section. Here for the Sunbox, we have a step modulator, controls, routing, LFO, controls, the mode and routing. Then we have an effects section with traditional effects, equalizer, drive, chorus, delay, and reverb. Then we have an ARP section with 2 different arpeggiators. But let's come back to the main and take a look at what's going on here. So this is the patch that was being played in the track that I just played back. It's got a really rich, thick sound, the Sunbox here. I really like this one. But we can navigate through our patches up here. We can come to the right or left and move to the previous and next presets. We can also double click here and then choose by type. So we have basics, ARPs, mixed, one key, and so on through here. So we can select, say, come to the basics here and choose initialize. I'll just double click that. And we then have our initialized preset. And I'm actually going to take a quick second to turn off the effects on my master channel so we can hear more clearly the Sunbox and the rest of these instruments without any processing. Okay, so I now have the effects turned off on my master channel. So with this initialized preset, then we can see we have power active for this first layer. The second one is not active, but if I click on the power, then we have our traditional amp controls. And since we're working with 2 layers, many of these synths are going to have control for whether you're manipulating one or the other layer or both at the same time. So I'm going to take this attack back down. Let's select both layers and then increase the attack and take our release up. Okay, we then have filter control here, which is on low pass by default. Taking the frequency down. We can turn that off or switch to band pass or high pass here. Let's come back to the low pass. We could then come to our effects, add some drive. A bit of reverb. Okay, so you can see how you can go about tweaking and creating your own preset or sound from an initialized preset here. If we come back and let's switch to the next one and come back to that initialize on our main here. Now we're back to this first layer being active, the second is not. Just know that you can choose a different waveform here in this window. So clicking on this area here, we can choose different samples to use. Waveforms analog, we have basic, so we were using SAW 16, we can switch this to different square types. We can then use the buttons here to navigate between these individual presets for this particular layer. Power on the second. Change the presets there. And we then have different discrete volume controls and panning for each layer. Let's deactivate the noise on layer 2 and come to the arpeggiator section just to see that we can activate the power for the arpeggiator here. Control the steps. Octave. There's different presets that you can choose from here. We've got gate control. We can use the CC on off, octave, the mode, and we have a second arpeggiator for our second layer. We could also link 1 and 2 together if we'd like to make use of that. And then here in the center, we have titles for what each of these columns is going to do. So this top is going to adjust our velocity. We can tie the mode, semitone, panning, gate, and CC1. So there's a ton of control here in both of these arpeggiator sections. So let's now move on to the next track, which was creating the basic drum beat for the song. And that was with the Prime 8 Plus, which is based on samples from the 808. So here we have the Prime 8 Plus, and I'm going to go ahead and play back the track again just so we can hear this soloed by itself. Okay, so in the center here, we can see each of the different channels for the drum sounds that we're using. We've got accent, the bass, the snare, low tom, mid tom, and so on all the way across. We have some similar controls for each of these. For the level, we've got solo, mute, tone, decay, and we can determine when and how these will be triggered down in the step sequencer below here. So by clicking once, then we're going to trigger at full velocity. If we click again, then it's going to be a bit lower. Clicking again, then we are turning off that trigger for the bass drum. And we're working with the bass drum because we have this dial here where we can select which drum sound that we're working on. So right now we're on bass drum. We can click, hold, and drag, or use the mouse wheel to change to the snare. And we can see that the snare is being triggered on 9. And we have 2 different pages here. So if I come to page 2, then that's not really going to change because the snare is hitting on 9. Let's come back to the bass drum, change to page 2. Those are both the same. And this is actually because we're only using 1 page or 16 steps for this particular pattern. If I were to click on this button here, we then switch to the second page, and then we can add programming for this kit here. For now, let's just go ahead and come back to the 1 page with our 16 steps. And up in the top right hand corner, we have multi, so we can send our drums out to multiple outputs, and you would set that up in your DAW. That's going to vary a little bit different based on the DAW that you're using. We then have a little switch here to work with our instrument page, or we can come to our effects and then add effects to the individual channels or drum sounds for the kit that we're working with. We then have swing in the bottom right hand corner that we can add to our patterns. So Primate comes with built-in patterns, and you can trigger those by first pressing C3 on your controller or drum pad. So if I press C3, we can see that we're cycling through these 16 steps, and we're playing back the pattern that was used in my track. I can trigger with different keys. To hear back different patterns. And if you have a pattern that you like, you can actually click generate here, and then you can click hold and drag that to the track that the Prime 8 is on within your DAW. Then you'll have that MIDI information generated from the pattern that you would like. And that pattern is going to show here on this wheel here. So once you trigger, if you trigger the pattern with the key and you find one that you like, this is automatically going to change to that pattern. So when you click generate and then drag to your track, it's going to be generating MIDI for pattern 5. If I were to press C3 again, then you notice this switches to 1. So then when I click generate and then drag that to the track, it's going to be creating for pattern 1. Now, as we saw with the Sunbox synth at the beginning of the video, we can navigate through our kits by coming here and using the previous and next buttons. We can also double click, and then we can access by category, ambient, 808 classics, init presets. So if I were to choose the initialize, let's double click, and I'm gonna, on my controller, I'm gonna trigger with C1. And then in this way, when we're using C1, we can trigger the individual drum sounds. So maybe we don't want to use a pre-programmed pattern, we want to create our own. So by starting on C1, in whatever preset you choose, you can then trigger the individual drum sounds yourself, and then record that live or program in your drum editor. Okay, so now let's take a look at the next instrument in our track, and that would be the bitzone. So as I mentioned, the bitzone is based on samples from the original synth, the Krumar Bit 99, which is an Italian synth. And right now, let's go ahead and play back this track soloed from the song at the beginning of our video. Okay, and so as I mentioned, these interfaces are going to be based on or a bit similar to the original hardware device that the samples were recorded from. So this is going to resemble the interface or the design on the Krumar. But as I was saying, we still have the two layers that we're working with and familiar controls for amplitude, our filter, and then again, as we saw, we can choose whether the amplitude adjustments and filter adjustments are going to affect just layer 1, layer 2, or both layer 1 and 2 at the same time. And then as we saw on the Sunbox, we have the same main, edit, mod, effects, and arpeggiator sections. So let's double click on the preset window here and let's choose 2. And so let's come to the left to the bitzone basics and init mono. Okay. So now we can see layer 1 is active, and we can tell because that's highlighted. Layer 2 is turned off, and we can see the sample that we're using, the recorded sample from the original synth, in this window down below. And so that is a saw. So if I trigger, if we activate layer 2, that's going to play back the same saw as well. Let's turn that on. But an octave below. Again, if we want to adjust both one or separately, we can choose 1, 2, but I want to select both and then take the amplitude or the attack up a bit. And the release. And as with the Sunbox, we can come to our effects, add some drive, chorus, delay, reverb, and also with the Sunbox, we've got our arpeggiator. So arpeggiator 1 will be for layer 1, arpeggiator 2 for layer 2. Again, we can link these, which is a similar control. So we basically have similar controls for each of these synths. They're just laid out a little bit differently to represent the original instrument that these were based on. And we'll take a closer look at bitzone in a future video, but for now, let's move on to the next track, which has a PXP10, which is based on samples or recordings from the Prophet 10. And if you notice, as with the other synthesizers, things are a little bit differently laid out, but we have the same main edit, mod, effects, and art controls. And then here at the top, we have our 2 different layers, layer 1, layer 2. These are labeled as upper and lower within the P10. And let's go ahead and listen to this played back in solo to check out what it was doing in our track. Okay, so this is definitely by far one of my favorite instruments in the Vintage Vault bundle because I think it has a really rich sound, and I'm a big fan of analog synthesizers, even though I can't afford one myself. But that's the great thing about software and Vintage Vault. It makes some of these sounds more accessible for us. So let's come up to the preset menu, and I'm going to double click, and I want to take this to basics again because I like to just start from scratch and just show these controls. And what I would like is actually the init mono. So let's load that up. And we can see within our layers, the upper layer is powered on, the lower is not. So right now, we've just got a basic saw, which is a sample being played back or multiple samples being played back from the original instrument. If we go ahead and activate the lower layer, we can activate our filter. We've got off by default, but then we can choose low pass, band pass, or high pass. Let's choose low pass. And let's come to the edit controls. And you can see by default, we're going to edit the upper and lower layer at the same time because this is selected. If we'd like to adjust just the upper, then we can choose that. The lower, we can select here, and we can see that the octave for the lower is -1, whereas the upper is on 0. We can change this to the mode from the stereo mode from off to alternating or unison, detune, spread, We've got controls for the mod wheel where we can power these on and introduce vibrato, tremolo, or filter by using the mod wheel. Let's come to our effects. Add some drive. Chorus. That's what I like. And for this, let's come back to the presets and give a listen to a few of these. Okay, let's move on to the final instrument in our track, and that is the UVXXX. Now, the UVXXX is based on samples recorded from the OBX, OBXA, and the OBSX. And this is also another one of my favorite instruments from the collection, just because I'm a huge fan of analog synths. So as we've done with the other instruments, let's go ahead and play back with this track soloed so we can hear that what it was doing in our track. Okay, and if you've been watching the whole video, I'm sure you're noticing a trend here of what I was saying about the interface design, that these are going to be based on a similar design as the original analog gear that these were recorded from. So this is matching a bit with that design. And then also up top here, we're seeing a recurring trend where we have our main, we then have our edit for finer control of our oscillators or samples, the modulation section, our effects section with drive, chorus, phasing, delay, and reverb, and our arpeggiator. Coming back to the main, as far as layers are concerned, we can see we have oscillator 1 with different selections here, and then oscillator 2 with a preset menu here. We then have power buttons for each of them, these layers or oscillators, to turn them on and off. We then have the edit section, which is going to allow us to edit discretely the controls for each of the oscillators 1 and 2. With this selected, we can then adjust the filter section, our cutoff, resonance, and so on, whether we're going to use the low pass, band pass, high pass, or just turn that off. We then have our amplitude envelope, familiar ADSR controls for the amplitude, as well as ADSR for our filter. And as we've done with the other synths, let's come to the preset menu and double click, and then let's try to take this to an initialized patch. So we're basically just going to have to do that within here. So when we double click this, we start off with the power off for our oscillator 2, and power's on here, and we have 16 selected. If we play this back, we have a basic saw, it sounds like. We can then select these different samples here, noise. We can then power on oscillator 2. And for oscillator 2, we actually have a preset menu that we can choose from. So for waveforms, XA waveforms for the different sampled hardware synths, let's choose unison saw. Previous to next controls. We've got the stereo mode that we saw in the P10, or we could choose alternate or unison. Okay, and the final thing we'll say about this instrument is that I missed this up at the top. We can also choose from presets here for quick access, brass chords, effects, keyboards, anything that you need here. Okay, so this has been a look at some of just a few of my favorite instruments that are included in the Vintage Vault selection. I hope that you've got some useful information out of this and seeing how these synths work and what they're based on and how their sound is as far as quality is concerned. If you have any questions, just leave a comment below, and otherwise I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.